Thank you everyone for your patience, and I'm really excited to see everyone coming in here for our event this evening, which is an evening with Joe Sacco, who is sitting right next to me. My name is Professor Kate Phelps-Devins. I teach comic studies here at the University of Oregon, and I'd just like to begin with a brief preamble. We're incredibly fortunate tonight to have groundbreaking artist Joe Sacco with us. Sacco defined the genre of contemporary comics journalism, the reason we are all here today, and is the sine qua non for this show. I can say personally, when Joe said he would do it, I knew it would happen, no matter what. Drawing from his training as a journalism student here at the University of Oregon, Joe has painstakingly produced a number of works of graphic reportage spanning the last 3 decades. From his early work in Yahoo, to his series chronicling his travels in the occupied territories, Palestine, to his books recounting the war in the Balkans, Safe Area Goražde, The Fixer, A Story from Sarajevo, Shoba, War's End, Profiles from Bosnia, to his masterpiece, the Ridenhour Book Prize awardee, Footnotes in Gaza, to his collection of short-form pieces, journalism, to his most recent work on resource extraction and the lifeways of the Dené people paying the land. Joe's oeuvre chronicles a vast range of contemporary and historical events, from the First Intifada to the Suez Crisis, the Gulf War, current trans-Mediterranean refugee crisis, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, and the abject poverty of Indian Dalits in Kushinagar. Joe has also co-authored From the Folks Who Brought You the Weekend, a short illustrated history of labor in the United States, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, a harrowing account of life in 4 of the most impoverished areas in the US. Let me know also if you start to get dizzy, and I'll try to change the duration on the slides. It was a laborious effort. It is nearly impossible to do justice to Joe's work, not merely because of the complexity and diversity of his oeuvre, but because Joe's comics actually do justice in a way that words about them, especially mine, will always fail to capture. Joe does not merely enhance journalism with images. His work radically reimagines the possibilities of both comics and journalism, and it has led to a new movement of comics journalism around the globe, 7 of whom are right here in this room. Joe's comics are intrinsically invested in what comic scholar Hilary Shute calls an ethics of attention. Rather than producing news for a disposable 24-hour cycle, Joe uses an unlikely medium to assert the necessity for journalism to chronicle world events and human lives with care and lasting relevance. Each of his work testifies to his dogged reporting, which is reflected in every crosshatched, stippled page, even if it is also a meditative, spacing out form of work. Joe's art challenges you to care about others as reverently as his pen renders their suffering. As he has stated in his manifesto, and this is a slightly long quote, "I mean to signal to the reader that journalism is a process with seams and imperfections practiced by a human being. It is not a cold science carried out behind plexiglass by a robot. I chiefly concern myself with those who seldom get a hearing, and I don't feel it is incumbent on me to balance their voices with the well-crafted apologetics of the powerful." By highlighting the subjective nature of all reporting, Joe's work contends that journalism is a process conducted by humans and shaped by human hands. In Joe's reporting on African refugees in Malta, The Unwanted, and we'll see if we can find this, he uses mise-en-page in order to stage an impossible yet direct visual encounter between migrant interviewees, such as John from Eritrea, and the viewer who is confronted with John's gaze. Joe's paginal composition is arranged so that each panel meets the gaze of the reader synchronically, while simultaneously alerting the reader to the panel's linear and tabular relationships of unequal position, place, and scale. John's boat shrinks across panels depicting his journey as the frames themselves become increasingly skewed so as to show the discombobulation of the passengers. His text boxes cascade like waves, beating against the migrants' boat and amplifying the repetitive, grueling nature of their voyage. As Joe has said, the blessing of an inherently interpretive medium like comics is that it hasn't allowed me to lock myself within the confines of traditional journalism. By making it difficult to draw myself out of a scene, it hasn't permitted me to make a virtue of dispassion. For good or for ill, the comics medium is adamant, and it has forced me to make choices. In my view, that is part of its message. Please welcome Joe Sacco.
Thank you very much. And can I say something? I mean, that was really lovely. But this whole weekend, it feels like a funeral oration. So I kept pinching myself to make sure I'm still alive.
You're a living legend. Enjoy it while you can.
Yeah, I guess I should enjoy it.
Some point it won't be as much fun.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll actually take this off. I wanted to start off with a question just because we're here at your alma mater, which is, I think, a dream for lots of people, is to go back to your school and show them what you did with your life. But I think we also have a lot of young people and students here. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you, having gone through the journalism program here, what's something you would go back and tell, 18, 19-year-old Joe Sacco that you think would have been important in the trajectory of your career?
Oh, that was important. Don't listen to your professors.
I'm going to ask that a lot of you not listen to over there. I'll have to put that pen away.
Well, I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but what was a little disappointing about the journalism program when I was here was that I didn't feel like some of the journalism professors were lighting a fire under my ass. I think the question was often, well, what would this be for? What would be the market for this piece you're trying to pitch me as a professor? And I think an 18 or a 19-year-old, I think wants some period in their lives where they feel like they're being told, go out and change things or change the world before they're sort of confronted with the realities of the market. And actually, when I got out of school, I was confronted with the realities of the market. So, yeah, maybe that. I mean, I got a great education here, but I think that my education really started in high school, and I think being on the student newspaper, having a couple of high school teachers that really took an interest, and they made it clear to me why the profession mattered. And I knew what I wanted to do right there and then. I wanted to be a journalist. I mean, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I never thought I would end up doing comics, to be honest.
Can you tell us about when that became something that you realized about what you were doing, either earlier when you're doing But I Like It or when you're doing Palestine? When did you realize you were doing comics journalism?
Probably somewhere in the process of being in the Middle East and doing the comic Palestine, because when I first went there, I didn't have a theory of what I was doing. I mean, I came out of the sort of the alternative autobiographical tradition, and so I was very interested in what was going on in the Middle East for many reasons. I really felt like I had to go see, and I thought I would do a series of comics about a travelogue about my experiences. But when I got there, I just began behaving like a journalist because of the schooling I had. So rather than just having these chance encounters with people that would be kind of, interesting or poignant or amusing, I found myself interviewing people. I wanted to get their words right. I wanted to find out what had happened to them. And then, while I was there, I realized, I'm actually doing something about the occupation, what people's lives were like under the occupation. And then I began thinking, well, what are the different facets of the occupation and trying to fill in, get stories about each facet, like cutting down trees, the demolition of homes, people being tortured and imprisoned, and it was possible to do. So I mean, basically I began behaving as a journalist without really having that intent and really not being so aware of my intent. Things really developed organically for me. I didn't set out to do this.
But then when you knew, at what point did you know you were going to put this in comics form, and how did that arise?
I knew I was going to do it in comics form because at that point I already had a comic book series called Yahoo, which was 6 comics that came out over a number of years. I was trying to make a living doing rock posters and album covers and stuff like that. And before I went, I knew I wanted to do a series of comics about whatever my experiences would be. And at some point I realized also that the idea of trying to sell a book to a publisher or a series of comics to a publisher about Palestinians just seemed ludicrous to me, that at that point it was just like rolling the dice, you know.
Can you tell us about that process? Because again, you've already brought up the idea of market, and I think everyone, all of our incredible comics journalists would agree, this is the most lucrative career you can possibly choose right now. So for all the young people in the audience, definitely, if you want to get rich quick, consider a career in comics journalism. But seriously, I mean, did you have a sense when you're doing this that you could ever sell it? And if so, who were the people that kind of guided you in that?
I didn't know I could sell it, but I returned to the United States. I was actually living in Berlin at the time when I made this trip to the Palestinian territories. I moved back to the States, and I was at a party in Seattle with the people from Fantagraphics Books, and I really didn't think they were going to go for it. I just sort of mentioned I spent time there, and I'm thinking of doing a series of comics, and right away Gary Groth and Kim Thompson, who were running the ship there, they said, "Oh, we'll put that out," which truly was a surprise to me, because I didn't see how that would sell. And actually, they stuck with it. It was 9 issues, came out over a period of about 3.5 years or so, and each issue sold less than the one before. And I mean, they had to cancel books, but they weren't canceling my book, even though I think the last issue sold less than 2,000 in North America. I mean, Jesus was talking about being under the radar, and that's how it felt. But there was a good thing about that too, in that I kind of found my voice without people telling me, you can't do that. No one was paying attention. So I wasn't being told, well, you cannot do something about the Palestinians, this is anti-Semitic, this is that. No, and at the time I might have been a bit more impressionable. I might have folded under some pressure, who knows, but I never had that pressure because no one cared. You know? No one cared.
It's terribly impressive.
It worked in my favor. I felt it worked in my favor. Because like I said, I found my voice, you know.
What about, because I think your voice is at once so singular and something that any one of us could pick out from across the room, but I think you also, from Palestine, even from issue 1 to the final issue, you're changing style a lot during that period, and maybe that's a process of finding your voice. What are the things you think you learned or discovered formally as you were going through those early issues?
Well, first of all, the first issue or 2, I had some pretty negative feedback, both by Jews and Arabs, saying that you're drawing us like this. And I had no other way to draw. I didn't have sort of the artistic vocabulary to draw people really realistically. But I realized I have to sort of listen to this, and I tried to sort of pound my drawing into more representational work, which over time I think I've gotten to where as far as I can sort of go with it. But it's painstaking. It's not naturally how I draw. I draw in that Bigfoot style, kind of crazy. That's how I want to draw. My hand wants to go in that direction. So over time I learned to temper that. What I didn't temper very much was the crazy panel structure. the wild, worm's eye view and then overhead shots, and a lot of that was not done thinking about the narrative so much as it was done what is going to interest me to draw today, because I was trying to amuse myself in some respect, or trying to keep myself interested. And over time, I mean, not just from Palestine, but if you look at the very last issues of Palestine, and then you see my work subsequent to that, I've toned down a lot of the crazy panel structures that I was doing. I still use that, but sort of to effect, and now I've kind of learned driving the narrative does not always mean drawing the most interesting thing you want to draw. Sometimes it means just drawing a face. Sometimes it means a talking head, which to me is kind of boring to draw. But you're trying to work with the narrative. And I learned that over those issues. Yeah, it was possible to do that.
When you talk about your artistic vocabulary, where did that come from before Palestine? Like, where were you developing these skills? And especially, I think everyone's always struck by your virtuosic, like, technical drawings, especially of buildings, but also trucks, like stuff that a lot of people struggle a lot with, like making round tires and making sure that all works. So where did that originate?
I never took an art class, but in junior high, I took 2 years of drafting. And that had a big impact on how I mean, we were given like mechanical things to draw, like a nut or a screw or something like that, and draw this and shade it so it looks three-dimensional. I mean, that drawing those mechanical things helped me later to learn how to draw things like realistic things. I think you can see in my early work, I can draw buildings and vehicles better than I can draw people. Organic matter took time to learn how to draw.
It moves. It has a lot of, it's always doing things. That makes sense.
And it wiggles. So I don't consider myself, I know artists who I see them draw and I think, oh, this is a natural, this person knows how to draw naturally, it just comes out of their hand. I've never been that. I've had to sweat everything, basically.
What do you think, I mean, if you look at paying the land, in so many ways, what you're saying about panels is still true, except that the landscape has almost become its own character in the book. And so in your most recent work, you'll have entire pages where there really aren't panels as we know them and as we study them. How do you think that is a part of your artistic trajectory in terms of form or in terms of what you're interested in?
Well, as far as not having panels for some of those opening scenes, if you haven't seen the book, it starts with an indigenous person talking about living on the land, and there are no borders. There are different illustrations, but there are no borders. I was struck by something two Indian cartoonists, subcontinental India, had said about looking at Western art. And I think they were indigenous. They were from an indigenous group in India. And they said, I'm not going to put borders around my people. I mean, that's trapping them. And that sort of struck with, that what they said sort of had an influence on me, and I thought, okay, I want to show something open, people living lives in a very unstructured way. And that's why I made that decision, because later on, the same person, the indigenous people will be regimented in the residential schools, and then I'll begin to compress them in borders too, panel borders and boxes. So that was part of the reason I did that. I really wanted to have an openness and a feeling of sort of freedom somehow to replicate the way he described his own life. I think that answers the question. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it opens up many more, but that's a fantastic answer. I guess in terms of all the places you've gone, you've talked about, and even in, I think, some of the quotes, there's a sense where you're making a selection about where you're going to go. So what are some of the things that inform the stories that you're choosing and the way that you're deciding what you're going to actually make a comic about?
Well, a lot of this material was really well covered by the first panel today. I sort of want to avoid saying a lot of what they said because it really rung true with me. But to me, it's about what hits me in the gut. And I sort of sit myself down and say, will you still be interested in this subject? Will it still matter to you in 3 years or 5 years, or whatever it is? And you sort of have a talk with your future self. And I always go through sort of a mid-project crisis in a way. And then I say, well, listen to who you were a few years ago, and does that person still make sense to you? And always that person has. I mean, there are many things that interest me, but what kind of angers me or infuriates me or makes me feel like I have to do something, whatever that is, I listen to that part of me. I listen to the side that is angry. And then, comics to me is channeling anger. It's my revenge somehow. And I feel it's constructive. Because when I talk about some of the places I've gone to, I have a way of being a little inflamed or strident, and I see people's eyes glaze over, and I realize I want to remove the glaze from the reader's eye so they just keep looking. So I know how to mediate my own frustration or anger, whatever it is, and put it onto the page. I know how to do that. I wouldn't be good at telling you my experiences in certain places because I'd come across as a different kind of person.
Do you think, just given this idea of the anger driving a lot of the work, are there certain things that you feel too angry about to even kind of approach or to think about in that way?
No, not really. I do feel, for example, I have to stop working on the Palestinian issue. I think I've done as much as I can do there. Because otherwise I think I could see myself going into activism, and I don't really consider myself an activist. So I will sign petitions about the Palestinians, now like the BDS thing. I'll sign a petition, and that will basically disqualify you from getting into the country. So I know I've burned that bridge. But generally I try to be I try to keep if I want to do journalism, you have to keep some cards close to your chest as well.
What would you say, in terms of the non-comics journalists, who are the people who are guiding the way that you're approaching your journalistic endeavor?
Well, this might be repeated from tomorrow, but Michael Herr was a big influence. He wrote a book called Dispatches. Had a big influence on me. And of course the work of Hunter S. Thompson. There's a lot of good journalism you can read in the New York Times, but it's not engaging. They call it the gray lady for more reasons than one. Hunter S. Thompson made me realize you could feel the passion. You could feel the fact that he was involved, he had an opinion. I remember reading his book on Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, which I consider probably the best book on American politics I've ever read. In some points it just becomes incoherent, but what you realize is he really understands the electoral process. He knows how it works. He knows the ins and outs as any good journalist would do. But he's willing to sort of approach the topic as sort of appalled at what's being thrown up. I think he was talking about Muskie. Edmund Muskie, was that the name? And I remember him saying, we heard his stump speech and it was bullshit. And in the evening he gave the same speech and it felt like bullshit with gravy. And I thought, what else do you have to say about his stump speech? It held its passion, but he understood the politics, and I was really drawn to that. I was really drawn to making difficult situations not just accessible, but really interesting and full of sort of the dust and the spit and the swirl of what you're finding. And I wanted to give that the reader, that the taste in their mouths, that's what I got from Michael Herr. Of course, I'm interested in other journals, like just the sheer dedication to the work that George Orwell had. I mean, you know, some of the names you hear mentioned a lot, and for good reason. But there have been some great journalists along the ways. I mean, it's always the journalists that care. And the funny thing is, I've met a lot of mainstream journalists, New York Times correspondents, other big publication journalists in the Middle East, and you sit around at a table with them and you realize they care. It matters to them what they're doing. And then there's a process that they write in a certain way because they're writing for the New York Times, and their editors are going to expect this and not that. And I remember I would stop them in conversation and say, why isn't that story in your report? And they'd say, well, because it was a personal story, it had to do with what I was experiencing. And the New York Times, you know, they famously write, I mean, most American objective press writes itself out of a story. But in doing that, sometimes there's a disservice to the reader. Because sometimes I think of the reader as someone I'm sitting across a table from, and what do they want to know? And they want to know kind of the whole picture, not just, I'm not going to say, well, a 121-year-old resident of Rafah camp said this, and one person said that. It's like, it's way more than that when you're there.
I mean, so to me, of course, I think I told you this, the ending of Footnotes in Gaza, where you break down the cow, is one of the most impactful pieces I've ever seen in comic or journalistic work. Are there ways that you feel you're generally trying to mitigate that level of, personal response to the sorts of stories that you're hearing, especially ones like that?
Well, that story was interesting to me because, I was interviewing a lot of older people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, about something that happened in 1956. And I would say at the end of that 2 months, my guide, Abed, and I were kind of the world's foremost experts on that massacre, right? I mean, we heard it from so many different people, so many different angles, that I recognized in myself, like, getting impatient with people because they didn't understand it as well as I did. Like, I knew they were getting the story wrong at times, or they were getting the things mixed up. And at some point, I'm talking to, I met someone, he said, oh yeah, my grandfather was there, and he was at this episode, and come and speak to him. And this guy was he was past his prime in a lot of ways, and he was trying to tell me the story, and he couldn't sort of put it together. And, in the back of my head, you get that sort of cold journalistic calculation, like, I'm not getting anything out of this guy. And at some point, his grandson was sort of pushing him a little, and his grandson said, tell us, like, what did what was the main thing you remember? And he just said, the fear. And it just sort of hit me. It just hit me sort of sometimes the arrogance you can sort of drift into when you think you know more, and you don't. I don't know that fear. I mean, that really spoke to me in a way. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, I mean, I think absolutely it's such a powerful moment where you describe grappling with how little you did actually know, despite having spent so much time trying to get there. But that it's the emotion, right?
It is the emotion, and I think I feel more of the emotion when I'm drawing than when I can spend 2 months in a place, or 4 months, or 2 weeks, or whatever it is, and I'm collecting these stories, but I'm a little. Journalism is sort of a cold profession. You're trying to get these stories, and you're trying to. You want to be careful with the person, obviously, and you never want to push them beyond a certain point. I often give people I'm talking to a way out, or we can stop. And often people push themselves forward when they're telling me some difficult material. But you're trying to get information. And I can do, in one day, there's sometimes I'm doing 5 major interviews in one day. And you kind of have to, everything hard that you're hearing, you kind of have to throw over your shoulder and say, I'll figure that out later. And you're just going on to the next person. So at some point, by necessity, you have to sort of numb yourself a little to what you're hearing. Just you want to do a disservice to the person's story by not getting emotionally involved yourself. So there might be other ways of doing it, but that's the way I know how to do it.
Has anyone you've interviewed ever seemed put out by that? Like, somehow incensed that you weren't more emotionally affected by
No, never. I think I've never felt that.
What about when you're drawing? Are there moments where something that you put over your shoulder suddenly comes back, where you have to actually grapple with it visually in a way that's more affecting, or that does get to you?
Well, the actual art is more difficult for me, because all those things that, it was easier being in Gaza than drawing Gaza. All those things that you had to sort of, you kept at a distance while you're there, now you actually have to really interpret them on some level artistically. You actually have to draw the people, and in certain situations that are very uncomfortable, and you kind of have to, there's a certain method acting or whatever that takes place. I imagine the only thing I can relate it to is perhaps what actors might feel when they're trying to get inside someone. You're going to draw someone, you have to sort of be inside it to some extent. And then you begin to sort of see you have more of a relationship, let's say that, I don't want to overstate it, but more of a relationship to those things. And then that's actually difficult.
Has there been anything that in drawing you realized you really just couldn't finish the drawing and had to either leave it out or go about it some other way?
No, I always felt like I would continue. I might need to sort of slow down or think it through. But I felt like I had a service to do to the material. I went to people's places. I went outside of my own context, talked to people about often very difficult things. And you want to do that, you have to do that justice to the person's story. And you can't wuss out then. It's like they went through the trouble of opening up that door to you. Now go through it and just do what you told them you're going to do.
So I don't want to get too deep into your own mortality, but I know you said that you feel you only really have, maybe 5 more books in you.
Boy, if that. I have 2 more journalism books in me, I think that's it.
So first of all, what are those that you're currently working on?
The journalism book is about a riot that took place in India, in Uttar Pradesh, a district called Muzaffarnagar, and it's kind of a small riot by Indian standards, and I thought it would be interesting to see what people tell themselves about an event like that a year later. Mostly the perpetrators and others, and how they now put it all together. And it's about that. It's about how violence is used in democratic states. It's about a lot of different things, actually. I'm about to start working on that. Actually, I've already done some pages. I started working on that book before I started paying the land. And it's all written. The research is done. And then maybe I want to do a book, I don't know really, but I kind of I'm interested more in resistance now, how people that's what was interesting to me about doing a book like Paying the Land, because there's also an element of resistance, trying to reestablish culture, that sort of thing. And I'm sort of interested in liberation theology. I hear so many people disparage religious beliefs, and I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in God, but I've been around a lot of people who do, and I see a lot of people who get strength from that, and so I don't dismiss it out of hand. And I'm interested how those sorts of forces can be forces for change, not just, reactionary forces as we think of them often in the United States.
And then what about the non-journalism books that you're working on?
Oh, I'm working on, which is pure pleasure to draw. I'm working on my Rolling Stones book. So that's quite an unusual book with a lot. I don't even know what it's about. Really, it's hard for me to explain what it's about. But I've been working on it pretty much, playing hooky from journalism for a couple of years. I've really needed a break, so it's really a pleasure. But it ends up, I let it go where it wanted to go, and it ends up getting into very dark stuff, but in a completely different way, in a non-journalistic way. Though there are elements of journalism in it too, like I said, but yeah.
Yeah, you just got, there's what, a 2-page Sodom spread or something?
Oh, I'm doing because I started looking up images of Sodom in, the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I hope you've all read your Bible, and I'm sure you haven't. But you know about Sodom and Gomorrah and places that were destroyed by God because they were so evil. And most of the evil, if you read the Bible story, it's like beyond anything you could imagine, because these angels come down to Lot, and the men of Sodom are just running at them. They want to have sex with these angels, and Lot gives them protection in his household, and then offers his daughters to the crowd. It's the most twisted story you've ever read, but interesting. And I started looking up old, because a lot of what I'm doing in this, in what's really fun about this book I'm doing is I'm recreating old paintings. And not just sort of giving you an outline so you know what it's referencing. I'm literally trying to draw painting in black and white art and really trying to reproduce, because there's just out of the sheer pleasure in copying someone's work. And but I was looking for images of Sodom that I could copy, and there's nothing that just gives you a sense of it. So I decided to draw this very elaborate group sex scene. So that you will not be teaching here at the University of Malta.
I don't know. I'm sure there's probably.
There's no way.
How many? Can you get some hands from students today? Yeah. You would definitely take that class. What I would like to open this up to the crowd, but I want to ask, is there any story that you won't ever be able to do, but you wish you could, if there were a world enough time?
There are stories that I tell myself I'll work into the Stones book somehow. I'm trying to use the Stones book as a way of telling a lot of different things, maybe not doing a whole book. But there's a great story. I spent a lot, when I was in the war in Bosnia, I spent not just time on the Bosniak, the so-called Muslim-dominated side. I spent a lot of time on the Serb side, which I've never detailed. A lot of the people I met there. And there's a really sort of beautiful story about at a very short time when a bridge opened up and technically people were allowed to go back and forth and no one was going to, because it seemed too dangerous. And a couple of journalists and I collected someone who had a very good friend. A lot of friendships were divided by the war. And I want to tell the story of taking this friend over. And I was constantly delivering, it's kind of funny. I was being used as a postal service, because I could, with my press pass, I could go across the lines. So I was living with an older Serb woman named Rada, and she had Serb friends on the other side of the lines, and she'd say, can you go and buy me some pork and try to bring it through? Because you couldn't get pork because mostly Muslim, so you couldn't get pork in that side of Sarajevo. So I would go to the market, I'd meet her friends, I was taking notes between people, notes between friends who were fighting on the others on different sides. You know, it's, I would like to tell that story because there's a dark side to it, but there's also some real, the idea that people kept connections alive, even through a very brutal war, interests me also.
Yeah, I mean, again, topical.
Some things don't change.
Yeah. So I would love to open this up to questions from the audience, so please feel free, and if need be, I can come bring my microphone.
So what's your process? Do you draw at night when you get back to your hotel room, or?
You know, some cartoonists here would sketch, and I think that's a very good way of doing something, but I don't. I tend to take photos for reference. I spend most of my time talking to people. If you saw me in the field, I would look like just an ordinary prose journalist going around for the most part. I ask a lot of visual questions of people, like questions that a lot of journalists wouldn't ask normally. I don't keep a diary or anything like that, but when I'm working like that, I keep a very rigorous journal at night, because a lot of things happen that aren't really part of an interview. A lot of things, there are things that are said in the street as you're walking by someone, or something that, some incidents happening that isn't really about pulling out your notepad and whatever, and I try to record all that at night. Then, after all my work is done, I go back home and I transcribe all my tapes, and that can take weeks. And then I index my journal and I index all my interviews, so I know if there's a subject, I know who said it on in what journal, kind of. It's a very long process, but it really saves a lot of time later. Then I write an entire script, and I don't give myself visual directions. I don't do any storyboarding. I need something spontaneous. The script is done, but the day I'm drawing, I want to look at the script and say, oh, I'll draw this today. That's what I'll draw for that. I need something spontaneous to happen each day. I don't want to sort of have locked myself into a storyboard I came up with 5 years ago. That's a general idea of the process.
So you record them with some sort of tape recorder or something?
Yeah, I mean, my first work wasn't done that way because my first work was taking notes like I learned in journalism school. But later on it was cassette and then a digital recorder. And I really prefer to record every interview I do now. I mean, I really want to get precisely what people said without any gaps.
I'm really curious about The Fixer. That's such an interesting book. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how at what point you realized that was going to be the sort of the structure of that story in that time and place. Because normally The Fixer is exactly the one who doesn't show up in the story. It's the one who helps you get the story, but is sort of off stage or something. And he's such a bizarre, interesting character. You talked a little bit already today up in the gallery, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that particular book.
Sure. This is the question's about The Fixer. He was one of a number of people I thought I could make a book about. And there were so many people who let me sort of into their world and knew what I was trying to do. But like many things, you do 2 or 3 books about a subject, and then you kind of either need to move on or you feel like you're just retreading something. He was very interesting to me basically because he was the first person I met in Sarajevo. Really the first. I mean, I went to the Holiday Inn because I thought that's where journalists go, I heard. So, and no one was there, and except him. It was dark because there was no light. And he just said, I want to talk to you. And he thought I was a mark. He thought I was a journalist. There were almost no journalists there. The war was stale then, at that moment. So, I ended up talking to him, and it was clear to him that there was not much meat on these bones as far as like money to be made. In fact, my main concern was, how do I get out of the Holiday Inn? Because I will be here for 10 days if I have to pay what they are asking. And he was interesting because he started talking about being in these gangs. And it's something I didn't know much about. I'd read a little bit about, but he was sort of a first-hand account of a very interesting process in the disintegration of a society where you need armed gang members, thugs, whatever you want to call them, to protect you. And they were protected, and they were lauded, but then, the extortion starts, and their racket extends in another way as they're doing this military job. And that's very fascinating to me, how society breaks down. But he was interesting because he was telling me the story, he was a guide to it, and I thought his individual story, tracing his story is a way of telling the story. Because he was in one of those gangs, he was wounded, and he ended up seeing the gangs being crushed by the military when they finally built up their military, and seeing that process and feeling betrayed. So there was an interesting story for him to tell there, but then I realized that I was being worked in a certain way, and it was never clear when it's an interview and when he expects to be paid. And so every now and then I'd give him a little money, I'd buy him smokes. It was an interesting way of talking about two things at once: journalism and how trustworthy are your guides, or what is their agenda, and also that major story, that component of the war you don't normally hear about. But I remember once we were walking somewhere, and he was full of sort of bluff in a certain way, and he said something like, and I said, Nevin, he said, do you know what's the hardest animal to hunt? And I thought, God, I read this in a comic once. And he said, man. And I said, Jesus, Nevin. I said, I can make you look pretty bad in the comic. And he looked down at me and he said, I can make you look really bad in real life. What an interesting character. I mean, sometimes those places are characters. They're just amazing characters. And you just sort of let them take over. You realize this is an interesting guy. So,
thank you.
Sure.
With the
Other John?
yeah, with the places you go, what's the ways you communicate with people? With
Well, I mean, in some places, in a lot of places, people speak English, but then you're usually speaking to sort of an educated group, sort of self-selecting educated group. So I almost always have to have a translator and a guide. Usually my translator is my guide. And sometimes those things happen accidentally. Sometimes I'm a little more careful about it. I don't know if you were at the talk. I was in the museum itself, but preparing for that trip to my second major book about the Palestinians, the one in Gaza. I went to Gaza for 2 weeks. There was a guy who incidentally had written to me and said, "Oh, I really like your book, Palestine. I'm living in Ramallah. If you ever need some help, let me know." And I was thinking, oh, in 2 weeks I'm going to be there. Help me. And so he said, "I will take you to Gaza." In those days, it was very possible to go with a tourist visa into Gaza. And he said, "I'll take you and I'll introduce you to some people." And he introduced me to one guy, and we talked. It was sort of an exploratory trip. First of all, to find out that the idea I had for a story was, I could clearly get it. And second of all, to find someone who was willing to commit his time. Of course, I'm going to pay too, but it's a big deal to spend 2 months with someone you barely know. But we got to know each other in that 2-week visit. We did some work together. We were quite tight. And then we worked together through that process. In Canada, it's not like I needed a translator mostly, except in a couple of cases where some people didn't speak English. They spoke the language Dené language. But I did need someone to introduce me, because I find it's difficult to go into communities that are not your own, that you don't have an affinity with in some way, and not be introduced, because who are you? I mean, the question I got from a lot of people there is, all these researchers and PhD students are coming through, and a lot of indigenous people I was speaking to were saying, we give them we talk about our traditional knowledge, and then we never hear anything about it again. We never see what they've done. It ends up, they get their research done, and they've got their PhD dissertation done, and what's in it for us? What do we get out of this? That's a very valid question. So I couldn't go in blind like that, and I had to keep, I did keep lines of communication open with people there, and very recently did a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people who were in the book, just to find out what they thought of it and get their feedback on it. So in some cases you don't need a translator, but you do need a guide. In other places you definitely need a translator guide. Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
What did they think? You said you had a meeting with them. What did they think about that?
Pardon me?
You said you had a Zoom meeting with them. What did they think about that?
Oh, what do they think about the book? I guess the Paying the Land book. I think they were pleased with it. I mean, who doesn't want to be in a comic book? But I think they felt the book opened up a conversation amongst themselves. There are certain things that everyone knows in that society, I think, but they're so used to it that it's sort of unspoken in a certain way, and the book sort of allowed them to speak about those things and hear each other's voices on those things. And I think they liked that. I was worried the most about my depictions of traditional life. I got a lot of material out of the Yellowknife. Yellowknife is the capital in the Northwest Territories, and the archives there. You can research a lot online. So I did a lot of that. I tried to draw things right, but in the end, I sent that first chapter that shows a lot of traditional life to some indigenous people, including the person whose story it is, to see how they would react. And the reaction was good. And they feel it's useful for them to, especially to show the elders want to transmit information to the younger people, and I think they feel the book is useful in that regard. So that's good. I mean, one of my regrets is the book came out during COVID, so I wasn't able to go back up. I had plans to go into a workshop with some younger people and do some things, and but yeah, I mean, yeah, to answer your question, the reaction has been good, I think.
Andrew?
Just on that subject, I've always been curious. Was there ever any contact with Nevin after the fixer came out?
The question is, was there ever any contact with Nevin? We're in contact. I just heard from him about 3 or 4 days ago. He's in Paris. He got asylum in Paris, and one of the things he used to get asylum in Paris was he showed them the book, which I think was probably a wrong idea because it shows him smuggling guns in Marseille or something. You're trying to go to the French authorities. But he showed them the part of the book that talks about how he was displaced by Muslim refugees who were coming into Sarajevo, and some Serbs who had spent the whole war on the Bosniak side were being displaced, and I mentioned that in the book, and I think that helped him. So I've met him, and every time I go to Paris, I see him. We have coffee and we talk. Yeah, we're in pretty good contact. And it's funny, like he identifies himself like he'll go into a comic book store and say, "I'm the fixer." He's become himself through the book in this weird way. But the only thing, because it's not actually a flattering portrayal. The only thing he said is, should I really keep asking for money all the time or hitting you up for money? I said, yeah, you did, you know. But he felt it was a fair portrayal, I feel. So, yeah.
Who buys the coffee?
I buy the coffee. That's okay, you know. I mean, I feel it's weird because it's his story, and I did a lot of work. And he knew I was interviewing him for the story. But I'll always feel an obligation in some way to those people who told me their stories, in whatever small way or big way.
Yes.
Did you intend to write your book Palestine with a political stance, or does it have any political stance? Because in my opinion it doesn't have. It's very objectively written. Because I was going to translate it into Persian in Iran, and I talked with my publisher, and he told me that they cannot publish it. Because if this book Palestine was written in an anti-Israeli way, they were happy to publish it, but yet they didn't. Because the Iranian government is anti-Israeli.
Right.
So I think, in my opinion, it's objectively written. So I thought to ask you, what's your opinion? Have you written this with a political stance?
Could you hear it in the back? You heard that. I don't think of my book as that objective, to be honest, in the sense that the way I was taught journalism here and the way I've seen it practiced in the United States by most mainstream outlets is that you have to be objective in the sense that there's one side and there's the other side, and you have to sort of balance them out, which seems just radically unfair to me, because I feel like who has the megaphone in certain contexts? And my feeling is Americans knew very well what the Israeli stand was. Now, when I was doing that comic in the 1990s, you didn't really hear anything from the Palestinian side at all. So I felt like, you know, at the very end of the comic, I spent some time with some Israelis, but I very purposefully went to speak to Palestinians and hear what they have to say. Mainly because I felt in that particular issue, what impelled me to go there was feeling that objective style journalism, like, well, the Palestinians say this happened and the Israelis say that happened. That really did me a disservice, because I realized when I was growing up and when I was in high school, I wasn't paying a great deal of attention to what was going on in the Middle East. But what I knew was that Palestinians were terrorists. And I realized that changed to me in the early 80s when Israel invaded Lebanon. Actually, 1 year before that, when they were bombing Lebanon, and they were using vacuum bombs. I'd never heard of these weapons that America gave to them as defensive weapons. And they were taking down entire apartment buildings with these things. And suddenly I was thinking, oh, I thought the Israelis were the ones that were beleaguered in the Middle East. And then the year afterwards, there were the massacres in Sabra Shatila. And suddenly I thought, okay, these are Palestinians massacred. It was Phalangist allies. They were like these militias that were allied to the Israeli army of occupation at the time. The Israelis had put a cordon around Sabra and Shatila, and then these militias went in and killed a lot of Palestinians. And I thought, something else is going on. I thought the Palestinians were the terrorists. And so I began to investigate. And I'd already got my degree in journalism. And at some point, I think it was reading some Chomsky or some Edward Said, I thought, oh, this is what objective style journalism did to me on this issue. I wasn't really paying attention, but I had this view of Palestinians as terrorists. And I had to sort of break that down and deconstruct what had happened. And I realized that objectively speaking, you can report facts. You can be factual and give people the wrong idea by reporting certain facts, not providing a context, all kinds of reasons that you could sort of say, yes, Palestinian commandos landed on this beach and killed Israeli civilians. That's a fact. Yes, some guy was thrown from a cruise ship because he was Jewish. That's a fact. All these facts, and those things are true, but there are other things going on too that I never got the history, I never got the context. All I got in the end was Palestinians were terrorists. So I had to think, what has objectivity done to me? And then that's why I thought that I would go and not be objective. So you can tell your Persian publishers, I don't feel the book is anti-Israeli. I think it's showing what people go through under occupation, and the Israelis do not behave like angels. And nor, in fact, do Palestinians behave like angels when they're under those conditions. We have to understand the context of the power dynamic and what's going on.
Yes?
Journalists are, we all know, murdered all over the world. Have you ever been in a life-threatening situation?
The question is, have I ever been in a life-threatening situation? I mean, I would say not, except you've got to be really careful as a journalist, because sometimes you can get lazy about your situation. But I would say no. I mean, I've never felt like I was going to die. Let's say that. And the people around me had been in many life-threatening situations. A lot of people around me had been shot, spent time being tortured. I mean, one thing I've always been very aware of is I've always got an exit sign sort of flashing in the corner of my eye. I can always get out, or you say that till you can't get out, but I've always had a way of getting out. So I've not felt that, to be honest.
Annie?
So of all the comics publishing companies that you've worked with, which ones do you feel like were the most supportive with your work? And do they fund your trips when you go and you do this research?
The question is about funding. That's the part I didn't hear part of the question. The question about funding. No, I mean, I didn't know. Look, what was it? I was going to go to Fantagraphics and say, give me a few $1,000 to go to Palestine. I didn't do that. I mean, I went on my own dime. I stayed at a youth hostel the whole time I was there, except the time I spent in Gaza. And, 6 other guys sleeping in the room, people belching and farting. I'm trying to write in my journal. And I thought after Palestine, I thought I would try to get a book deal before I go to Bosnia. No doing. I mean, it was a different time. I mean, I was in New York, I went from this magazine, that magazine, and a lot of the younger editors were like, oh yeah, this is a great idea, let me get back to you, and they would go up a notch in the hierarchy, and there weren't many examples of this sort of thing, so it didn't make sense to them. So I went with savings. I sold art. I sold my art. I did some work here and there just to get there, and then try to make my money stretch. But the book Footnotes in Gaza is the first time I had an advance, and I'm really thankful for it because it was a more expensive trip in a lot of. There were a lot of expenses. You can get by maybe without spending money, but it's difficult if you want to pay people for the work they're doing for you, and you want to rent a place or whatever it is, you've got to have some money. So things are better now. They're better now. But those first 2 trips, those first 2 books were financed by myself.
You actually have your hand up.
So seeing the way you drew yourself in the comics and then seeing you now, they look very different. So what goes into the way you choose to depict yourself in your comics?
I get that question a fair amount, and I mean, believe it or not, I was telling you earlier about how I tried to draw more representationally. And so I was trying to draw everyone more realistically as much as I could. The character that it didn't even occur to me to change myself. I mean, I'm such shorthand for myself in a way that I never paid attention, and at some point, a couple years down the road of this process, someone said, how come everyone looks more realistic except you? And I didn't really have an answer for that, except I just didn't do that. And I have no real answer and explanation. Of course, a comics theorist will tell you that the reason I do it is because sort of a more amorphous version of myself is easier to put yourself in that person's shoes. That might be true, but that wasn't the reason. Now, to make myself look realistic, what seems so self-conscious, I don't think I could do it. So that's the long and the short of that one.
That's very...
How has your thinking developed over time on the ethics of writing about cultures that are not yours?
Oh, the ethics of writing about cultures that are not mine. I think I'm of the different generation that, to me, journalism was always about going and seeing what you were interested in and who you were interested in. And partly it was like, I want to know about the world. I want to know about the world. And journalism was the way of opening doors and learning. And you bring the reader with you. Getting to know the world is just part of what I want to do in my life. I've always sort of just given myself that permission. I recognize that you have to be very careful with cultures, obviously. I felt that the most in this last book with indigenous people, but I felt the biggest gatekeepers were white people, in a way. They were the ones always sort of instructing me on what not to ask or what to ask or how to be careful. And in some cases, the information was quite good. One thing I was told was don't interrupt. Shauna, who was my guide, she saw me she was with me for my first interview, and afterwards she said, you interrupted her a lot when you were talking. And I thought, okay. And she explained to me, in the culture, you just let someone talk, especially the elders. I mean, I really learned not to interrupt, so there's a lot of good information. But I also felt like some of what I was getting was holding me back from being myself, too. And I've always just relied on human-to-human connection. And I don't want to be paralyzed by the process and where I fit in the process. I want to sort of rely and depend on someone's humanity and my humanity and just that very raw thing. And I think that worked in my favor in the Northwest Territories. When I learned some basic ground rules, the things I was told, don't bring up residential schools, but people were bringing up residential schools. And, alcoholism, you want to be careful with that. People were talking about it openly to me. And I was thinking, well, just how do I put this in and show the context of this? And that my project became, okay, here are how communities have been ripped apart. Now, why are they ripped apart? How does, colonialism doesn't end in 2000 whatever, when there's some commission that says this was cultural genocide. Now we're going to pay people money for being in a residential school. It didn't end then. The trauma is passed down, and people are living. I did come up with this phrase. I can't remember what theoretician came up with it, but colonialism unspools over the generations after colonialism has stopped, or we think it has stopped. It doesn't stop. So I'm very aware of those sorts of things. And let's just say I trust myself.
In the back.
So you talked earlier a little bit about, kind of shifting from your notepad to cassette tapes to your digital recorder. I was wondering if there are any other technologies that you've incorporated into your processes, or that are part of, how you're archiving your work, or how you do your art, or anything along those lines that you could tell us about.
Well, it's interesting because I guess my first trip was on a white flyer to Palestine, a biplane, and it's funny to be this old and realizing how much has changed. maybe the fortunate or unfortunate thing for me, at some point I felt myself getting off the bus of change. So it's interesting to see like Dan Archer's work and to see web work. And I've actually done some web work, but I was kind of unsatisfied with it. I did a story about Srebrenica, the place in eastern Bosnia where there was the biggest massacre in Europe after World War II, since World War II. And I went to watch that. Every year they identify bodies from that massacre and they bury those bodies. And the year I went, they were burying 400 people all at once. They do it in a few minutes at a very large graveyard. And I did this story about talking to a lot of Serbs. How do they view the massacre in Srebrenica and the denial that is going on to this day that's causing problems even now as we speak. And it was difficult. It was a difficult process for me because I had to really think, doing something for the web, especially with some things that like Jesus showed, or where you click on something and something animates a little or something drops down. I felt like I was directing something. It wasn't my natural process. And the most unfortunate thing for me is now this company that commissioned me to go is now out of business, and as far as I know, this is no longer on the web. I guess I'm a print guy, and for good or for bad, maybe not keeping up with the times, which are clearly changing, but that's who I am now, and I'm kind of wedded to that, and it's what I understand. So a lot has changed over time, and like I say, at some point I'm comfortable where I am, and I'm an old fogey, so I'll ride it until I die.
You've been waiting, I'm sorry.
Thanks. So now that you've written about so many different places and so compellingly, do people contact you trying to get you interested in their region or their story?
Yeah, the question is, do people contact me? Yeah, they do. The only time I ever took someone up on it is an actress contacted me, and she was going to send some cartoonists to different places and poets and all this stuff. It was an interesting project. And she wanted me to go to southern Russia to meet Chechen refugees. And that was probably the only time I sort of looked at something and thought, is this going to interest me? And then I started reading about it, and it really did interest me. And so I was very grateful for that. But I've had people very recently contact me about, will you do a story about this ethnic group? And I'm the massacre guy, right? So it's like people will sometimes contact me because I think that's what I, can do, and maybe I can do that. I'm a little tired of doing that, but I can do that. But it's, I have to stick to what I've decided I want to do now. Though there are many things that interest me. They're just, in a lifetime, there wasn't, I guess there wasn't enough time for Joe to do what he wanted to do. He just wrapped up his work and faded away. And the web took over. Well, there'll be a burial tomorrow.
On a slightly more optimistic note, I just wanted to pick up on different formats, and so obviously you've had some work published in magazines as well, and I was wondering what that experience was like for you, and whether episodic or shorter content you feel is given to you sort of prominence, or if you, for that reason, you prefer the book because you sort of control it more.
The question was about whether I prefer long-form books or magazine pieces, smaller pieces. After I finished Footnotes in Gaza, I wanted to do that was a very long book, it's 300-some pages. I wanted to do more short-form pieces. There were a lot of things that interest me, and I did some work for Harper's and this great French magazine named 21, and other publications. And it was fun doing short form, except when it was very short form, like I did something for Time magazine that I think I failed at. I did something for the New York Times Sunday magazine, which was better, but really felt constricted. And I think, for me, I think everyone's different. All cartoonists have a different way of thinking about this, but if I can get to about 20 pages, I think I can sort of say something. But if you put me at 6, it's going to start to feel like headline news, a comics version of headline news. And I want to get some of the, to me, the important thing is to show some personality of some of the people I spoke to. If they're just going to say what they have to say, that's not enough for me. So I want some personality, you know, the color of a place in a way. That sort of thing is important to me. I really like doing books, but if the magazine pieces have been prominent in a way, and then you can collect those into a book, so that's a good thing too. I'm glad I've sort of shifted around. Everything I've done, I felt like I learned something from. It was a worthwhile experience.
Dave?
So this might be a little bit of a long question, but recently I read this comics artist, comic journalist put this on Facebook saying, comic artists and comic scholars live on 2 different planets. And you can travel from one to another, but you have to leave one behind to get to the other, and vice versa. There have been so much written about your text, about your books. Has there been any point, not even about your books, but also about other comics journalists or comics works that you have looked at and said, oh, that's something interesting, that's an interesting observation, and I would want to probably think about it, or probably looked at a book and said, that's hilarious, that never happens, or something like that?
Ooh. That's a hard one in a way. I have been informed by some of the works. Sometimes they'll point something out in my work, and I'll think, oh, that's a great way of thinking about it. And that's okay with me because I think a lot of is open to some form of interpretation. And I don't know how my colleagues feel about a lot of this stuff, but I feel like a lot of things if they're thought out, some things are really thought out quickly. And you tend to sort of make theory out of it, or answer questions about it. You're answering questions that you haven't really posed to yourself. A lot happens really organically, where the main problem I've had is I've always loved the mystery of what I'm doing and the mystery to myself. And even Scott McCloud's book, which I think a lot of younger cartoonists really like, I like the guy. I think he says a lot of interesting things, but I kind of don't want to know what I do. I don't want to break it down so much sometimes because I want it to be what it is and not think, oh, what's going to happen between the panels here? Or what is the reader think? I mean, I am thinking of these things but quickly sometimes. And now I think Ben was saying something today about you become, you're a cartoonist now. You think in those terms. I mean, I'm sure you guys sometimes you're in a situation you can sort of see the thought bubble above someone's head and you know how this is going to work as a comic. At some point, it's just your neurons, your neural pathways really make you that person that's thinking in those ways. And you don't question a lot of stuff anymore. It's really informative to read. Actually, it's more informative to talk to a comic scholar like this, because sometimes reading the work, I don't understand it. I don't see my work through, Foucault or something. I can see how you could, and I'm kind of flattered, and I see why it can be told through post-colonial theory or something like that. But to me, it's something else, and I'm interested, but I am on a different planet to some extent. Yeah.
It's such a Foucauldian thing to say.
Well, that's what I said.
Keith, do you want to have the last question?
This is a heavy burden and maybe not such a good question. But you have produced such a remarkable body of work. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the inner critic or self-criticism in that production. How do you get to be able to finish something?
The inner critic? Yeah. But what was the last part of it?
How do you get from, yeah, go ahead, Kate.
How do you finish something? Well, because you've started it and you've got to. I mean, in the sense that I really do feel a responsibility to the material and to the people I trouble. And sometimes I've troubled these people. So it's important for me to continue the process. I remember when I was a young kid, I would start a comic and not finish it. And my mother used to say, "You never finish anything you start," which I felt was somewhat unfair. But she was my first critic, I guess. I'm self-critical in that there's things I've drawn that I think that's really good. I don't think I could replicate that, or I've really built upon that drawing. The drawing I did of the Palestinian refugee camp where there are no words, that's just become something I want to explore more and more, these kind of big images. I love that, the silence of those images sometimes. So there's a critique that says, well done, and there's other critique where I say, ooh, that's, I see a lot of mistakes in my drawing. The thing about comics too, you've got to move on, so I'm not a perfectionist. I know my work really looks detailed, but at some point I sort of say, okay, time to move on to the next panel, or you'll never finish this thing. So I move, and I let the very process of working over and over and over again sort of improve my work. But I'm critical of some things. I'm the most critical of this piece I did for Time magazine about Hebron. It's the one piece I felt like I began, oh, I'm doing something for Time magazine. How does a Time journalist think? I did everything I shouldn't have done, and I told myself beforehand I would never do. And I feel that piece is really constrained by sort of the tennis match of objective journalism. Oh, this side says this side says that. This washes out that. And it was ineffective. And the proof to me was a settler I talked to told someone that we mutually knew. Some years down the road, he had that up on his wall or something, and he said, "This was my finest moment." And boy, that's a critique.
Well, I just want to thank you. Joe is as gregarious as he is kind. He's also generous with his time. So he has already taken so much of his day to tell us about his work. But I want to remind everyone, he will do so again tomorrow. If he doesn't leave in the middle of the night and, check out. So please do return tomorrow. We will start at noon in Fort Hall over at the JSMA. And the symposium will continue with more roundtables, talks, and graduate student panels. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with all of us. Please, everyone.